The oppressive afternoon heat transformed the runway into a shimmering mirage. The scent of aviation fuel mingled with distant eucalyptus, creating an acrid perfume that clung to the throat. Beneath the relentless sun, a line of Curtiss P-40 Kittyhawks waited in formation, their shark-mouth nose art grinning defiantly at the cloudless sky. Flight Lieutenant James "Jimmy" Caldwell stood before his aircraft, running his hand along the warm metal fuselage. At 23, he looked older. The sun had carved premature lines around his eyes, and his sandy hair was bleached almost white. He wore his leather jacket despite the heat, a habit formed from too many scrambles at dawn, when the Queensland morning still carried a chill. Around him, 24 pilots from the Royal Australian Air Force's 3 Squadron gathered for their final briefing before deployment. They were young men, most barely out of their teens, with sun-darkened skin and the easy confidence of those who'd grown up under wide-open skies. They joked and smoked, their laughter carrying across the tarmac with forced lightness. Squadron leader Bobby Gibbs emerged from the operations building, his face grave. The laughter died. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying the distinctive Australian drawl softened by years of leadership. "In 72 hours, we ship out to the Middle East. North Africa. The Western Desert." A murmur rippled through the assembled pilots. They'd known this moment was coming, had trained for it, but hearing it spoken aloud made it real in a way that theory never could. "I won't sugarcoat this," Gibbs continued, his eyes scanning the faces before him. "The Germans consider us colonials, farm boys playing at war. The Luftwaffe, particularly their so-called experts, have made it abundantly clear they don't rate our training, our tactics, or our chances of survival." Jimmy felt his jaw tighten. He'd read the intelligence reports, seen the dismissive assessments from captured German pilots. "The Australians fly like they're herding cattle," one Luftwaffe ace had written. "Brave, perhaps, but hopelessly unsophisticated. They lack the precision and discipline of proper combat aviation. Their Africa Corps pilots have been fighting since 1940, Gibbs went on. They've got experience we can't match. They've got Bf-109s that can outclimb us, outrun us at altitude. They've got commanders who've forgotten more about desert warfare than we've learned." The sun beat down mercilessly. Sweat traced paths down Jimmy's spine. "They think we're going to be easy prey," Gibbs said, and now a thin smile crossed his weathered face. "I intend to prove them catastrophically wrong." He paused, letting the words settle. "We may not have their experience. We may not have their fancy German engineering and superior altitude performance. But we have something they've underestimated. We know how to adapt. We know how to survive. And we're about to teach them that training in the outback, where you learn to make do with what you've got, where you learn that second place means you don't come home. That training is worth a damn sight more than their arrogance can account for." That evening, the officers' mess was quieter than usual. Jimmy sat at a corner table with his closest friend, Flying Officer Alan Rawlinson, Raleigh to everyone who knew him. They'd grown up 3 streets apart in Brisbane, had learned to fly at the same civilian aerodrome, had joined the Raaf on the same day. "You worried?" Raleigh asked, nursing a beer that had long since gone warm. Jimmy considered the question. Outside, the last light was fading from the sky, painting it in shades of orange and purple that reminded him achingly of home, of his mother's kitchen window overlooking their garden, of his younger sister Margaret, who'd cried when he'd told her he was enlisting. "Yes," he admitted finally, "but not the way you'd think." "How then?" "I'm worried we'll get there and freeze. That all this training, all the theory and the practice runs, won't mean a damn thing when someone's actually trying to end our lives. I'm worried that the Germans are right, that we're just kids playing dress-up in our father's war." Raleigh was quiet for a long moment. Then he laughed, a short, bitter sound. "My old man fought at Gallipoli," he said. "You know what he told me before I shipped out for training? He said, 'The Turkish soldiers thought we were soft, thought we'd break the first time things got hard.' He looked me dead in the eye and said, 'We didn't break. We never break. It's not in us.'" Jimmy met his friend's gaze. And if we do, then we figure out how to put ourselves back together. That's what we do, mate. That's what Australians have always done. March 17, 1942. Aboard HMAT Zealandia, Indian Ocean. The troop ship cut through dark waters under a moonless sky. Below decks, the air was stifling, thick with the smell of oil, sweat, and too many men packed into too small a space. The Kittyhawks had been crated and loaded into the holds, and now their pilots had nothing to do but wait and think. Jimmy lay in his bunk, staring at the metal ceiling inches from his face. The ship rolled gently, and around him, he could hear the sounds of other men trying to sleep, snoring, restless shifting, occasionally a muffled cry as someone fought through a nightmare. He pulled a letter from his pocket, though it was too dark to read. He didn't need to. He'd memorized every word his mother had written. My dearest James, I know you must do what you feel is right. Your father would be proud. He always said you had his stubborn courage. But please, my darling boy, remember that courage doesn't mean throwing your life away. It means knowing when to press forward and when to pull back. It means coming home. Please come home to us. He folded the letter carefully and tucked it back into his jacket pocket, pressed close to his heart. Somewhere above, a bell rang out, the watch changing. The ship sailed on through the darkness, carrying its cargo of young men toward a war that had already consumed millions. April 2, 1942. RAF Sidi Hanaish, Western Desert, Egypt. The desert was nothing like the outback. Jimmy had expected similarities. Both were harsh, unforgiving landscapes where mistakes cost lives. But the Western Desert possessed a malevolence the outback lacked. The heat was worse, the sand finer and more invasive, working its way into every crevice of man and machine. Sandstorms could rise from nowhere, turning day into twilight, grounding aircraft and leaving men blind and choking. Their base was a collection of tents and improvised structures scattered across the sand. The runways were just cleared strips of desert, marked by oil drums filled with sand. At night, scorpions crawled into boots left unattended. During the day, the temperature inside the Kittyhawk's cockpits could reach 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Welcome to paradise, a RAF flight lieutenant said dryly, showing them to their accommodations. He was thin, weathered, with the 1,000-yard stare Jimmy was beginning to recognize in veterans. Jerry comes over most nights. Sometimes he drops bombs. Sometimes he just circles to keep us awake. Either way, you learn to sleep light. The British pilots regarded the Australians with thinly veiled skepticism. They'd been fighting the Luftwaffe and the Italian Regia Aeronautica for 2 years. They'd seen replacement squadrons arrive full of confidence and watched them get torn apart within weeks. Fresh meat, ground up in the desert's relentless machinery of war. That first night, lying on a canvas cot in a tent that offered no protection from either heat or cold, Jimmy listened to the distant rumble of artillery. The front lines were less than 50 miles away. Somewhere out there in the darkness, men were living in holes in the ground, fighting over patches of sand that looked identical to every other patch of sand, dying for reasons that grew hazier with each passing day. April 8, 1942. Pre-dawn. The scramble bell shattered the pre-dawn darkness. Jimmy was moving before he was fully awake, muscle memory taking over. Around him, other pilots tumbled from their cots, grabbing flight gear, running for the flight line where ground crews were already firing up the Kittyhawk's Allison V-1710 engines. The eastern horizon was just beginning to lighten, painting the desert in shades of gray and pink. The air was cold. In a few hours it would be scorching, but now it was cold enough to see breath misting. Squadron leader Gibbies was already at the operations tent, receiving the briefing. Reconnaissance reports a formation of Ju-87 Stukas heading for our forward positions, he called out as the pilots assembled. Escorted by Bf-109s, we're to intercept before they reach our boys on the ground. Jimmy felt his heart accelerate. This was it. Not a training exercise, not a practice run. Real aircraft flown by men who wanted them gone. Remember your training, Gibbies continued, his voice steady, reassuring. Stay in pairs. Watch each other's backs. Don't try to be heroes. We need you alive more than we need you glorious. Now mount up. Jimmy climbed into his Kittyhawk, his hands going through the familiar pre-flight routine automatically. Harness straps, fuel mixture, trim tabs, oxygen mask. The cockpit smelled of oil and metal and the faint residual scent of the last pilot's sweat. He looked out at Raleigh's aircraft, 3 planes down the line. His friend gave him a thumbs up, though Jimmy could see the tension in his shoulders. The Allison engine roared to life, 1,200 horsepower of American engineering vibrating through the airframe. One by one, the Kittyhawks taxied onto the desert runway, their propellers kicking up clouds of fine sand. Gibbies led them into the dawn sky. 15,000 feet above the western desert, the sun broke over the horizon, transforming the desert below into a sea of gold and shadow. At altitude, the air was thin and cold. Jimmy's breath came in measured huffs through his oxygen mask, each exhalation fogging briefly before vanishing. Bandits, 11 o'clock, slightly below. Gibbs's voice crackled over the radio. Stukas with top cover. Let's show these gentlemen what colonial farm boys can do. Jimmy's hands tightened on the control stick. His mouth was dry despite the oxygen. Through the plexiglass canopy, he could see them now. The distinctive gull-winged shapes of the Junkers Ju-87 Stukas, ugly but effective precision attack aircraft. And above them, like sharks circling, the sleek, deadly forms of Messerschmitt Bf-109 fighters. The Luftwaffe pilots had every reason for confidence. They were veterans of campaigns across Europe and Africa. They flew superior aircraft. They had tactics refined through years of combat. They had no idea what was about to happen. All aircraft, this is Red Leader. Gibbs's voice was calm, almost conversational. Remember, high-speed passes, don't get into turning fights. Use your diving speed, hit hard and get out. Execute. The Kittyhawks dove. What happened next would be analyzed, discussed, and argued over for decades. The official records would be dry, clinical. 3 Squadron RF engaged enemy aircraft at coordinates. Enemy losses. Friendly losses. Mission success. But the reality, the screaming wind, the chattering guns, the desperate maneuvering, the moment when training met instinct and instinct met will to survive, that reality could never be fully captured in words. Jimmy selected his target, a Stuka braking formation, trying to escape. He lined up the shot, watching the gunsight Pipper drift onto the enemy aircraft. His thumb hovered over the firing button. In that instant, stretched to infinity, he thought of his mother's letter, of Raleigh's father at Gallipoli, of every dismissive assessment the Germans had made about Australian pilots. He pressed the trigger. The 650 caliber machine guns roared, the Kittyhawks shuddering with their recoil. Tracers reached out across the morning sky, and the Stuka's wing erupted in a shower of metal fragments. The battle had begun, and in that moment, above the burning sands of North Africa, with the sun rising on another day of war, something shifted. The Luftwaffe's certainty wavered, their assumptions cracked. The Australians had arrived, the world became chaos. Jimmy's Kittyhawk screamed through the morning sky, the Allison engine howling at maximum power. The Stuka he'd hit was trailing smoke, its pilot fighting for control as the aircraft spiraled earthward. But there was no time to watch, no time to confirm the outcome. Already, the distinctive shape of a Bf-109 was diving toward him, sunlight glinting off its canopy. "Brake right! Brake right!" Raleigh's voice cracked over the radio, urgent and afraid. Jimmy yanked the stick hard over, feeling the G-forces crush him into his seat. The horizon tilted violently. Tracer rounds stitched the air where his aircraft had been a heartbeat before. Bright, deadly threads weaving patterns of destruction. His vision grayed at the edges. He eased the turn, gasping for breath behind his oxygen mask. The 109 flashed past, already climbing for another attack. Fast. So terribly fast. But the German pilot had made a mistake. In his eagerness to claim an easy victory over a colonial farm boy, he'd followed Jimmy into the dive. Down here, at lower altitude where the air was thicker, the Kittyhawk had advantages the intelligence briefs had emphasized, but the Luftwaffe had dismissed. Jimmy rolled inverted and pulled through, converting his diving speed into a climbing turn. The P-40 responded beautifully, its Curtiss engineers having designed it for exactly this kind of low-altitude knife fight. The 109 tried to follow, but its tight turn radius couldn't match the Kittyhawks at this altitude. For just a moment, Jimmy had the angle. His hands moved with a steadiness that surprised him. Stick forward, rudder pressure, throttle adjustment. The gunsight pipper drifted onto the 109's fuselage. He could see the black crosses on its wings, the number 7 painted in white on its tail. He fired. The .50 caliber rounds hammered out, and he watched them walk across the enemy fighter's wing root. Metal peeled back. Smoke erupted. The 109 snap-rolled violently and dove away, trailing a dark plume. Jimmy's heart was racing so fast he thought it might burst through his chest. His hands were shaking on the controls. He'd just shot at another human being. Possibly ended a life. The enormity of it threatened to overwhelm him. "Good shooting, Jimmy," Gibbs's voice cut through his spiral of thoughts. "Reform on me. We're not done yet." The battle lasted 17 minutes. When it was over, the sky above the western desert was empty of enemy aircraft. Below, 3 pillars of black smoke marked where Stukas had crashed into the sand. The ground forces the bombers had been targeting were safe. The Kittyhawks formed up, counting off. Jimmy's breath caught when the count reached 12 and stopped. They'd launched with 14 aircraft. "Red 7, Red 9, report," Gibbs called, his voice carefully neutral. Silence. Then, crackling through static. "Red 9 here. Engines taken damage. Making for base, might not make it." Still no word from Red 7. Jimmy glanced at the empty sky around them, willing another aircraft to appear. Red 7 was Pilot Officer Dave Mitchell, 19 years old, from a sheep station outside Broken Hill. He'd shown Jimmy a photograph of his girl before they'd scrambled, a pretty blonde named Sarah, smiling shyly at the camera. The radio remained silent. "All aircraft, return to base," Gibbs ordered. "Red 9, we'll follow you in." The flight home seemed to take forever. Below them, the desert scrolled past, indifferent to the drama that had just unfolded above it. Jimmy kept scanning the sky, hoping against hope to see a lone Kittyhawk limping toward friendly territory. He never did. RAF City Hanaish, 0715. The landing was rough. Jimmy's hands were still shaking, adrenaline making fine control difficult. The Kittyhawk bounced once, twice, then settled onto the desert runway in a cloud of dust. Ground crews were already running toward the aircraft, counting them as they taxied in. Jimmy saw the moment they realized someone wasn't coming back, saw their expressions shift from excitement to grim acknowledgement. He climbed out of the cockpit on unsteady legs. The desert heat hit him like a physical blow after the cold of high altitude. Around him, other pilots were emerging from their aircraft, some laughing with the wild relief of survival, others silent and pale. Raleigh appeared beside him, clapping a hand on his shoulder. His friend's face was streaked with sweat and oxygen mask indentations. "You all right?" Raleigh asked. Jimmy nodded, not trusting his voice. He looked at his Kittyhawk. The ground crew chief was already inspecting it, running his hands over the fuselage, checking for damage. The shark-mouthed nose art grinned up at the morning sun, incongruously cheerful. "Congratulations, sir," the chief said, pointing to the wing. There were several small holes, shrapnel or bullet strikes that had missed anything vital. "Your first action and you brought her home. That's good flying." Jimmy stared at the holes, realizing how close he'd come to not coming back at all. Operations Tent, 0800 hours. Squadron leader Gibbs stood before a map of the western desert, marking positions with a grease pencil. The assembled pilots sat on whatever they could find, ammunition crates, folding chairs, the ground. Jimmy noticed how the veterans from other squadrons watched them now with something approaching respect. "Initial assessment," Gibbs began, "is 3 Stukas confirmed destroyed, 2 probables, 4 109s damaged, 1 probable destroyed. That's a successful interception by any measure." He paused, his expression hardening. "We lost Pilot Officer Mitchell. Search and rescue is out looking, but..." He didn't finish the sentence. They all knew what desert crashes looked like. He was a good pilot and a good man. We'll honor him by learning from today's engagement. Gibbies turned back to the map. The Germans came at us expecting an easy fight. They're used to intimidating new squadrons, used to their aircraft's superior altitude performance carrying the day. What they weren't ready for was pilots who understood their own aircraft's strengths and had the discipline to fight to those strengths. He looked around the tent, making eye contact with each pilot. You stayed low. You used your diving speed and your turning ability. You didn't get baited into climbing contests you couldn't win. That's textbook tactics, and it worked. An RAF wing commander who'd been observing the briefing stepped forward. He was older, maybe 40, with a distinguished flying cross ribbon on his chest and scars on his hands that spoke of burns barely healed. "I've been in this theater for 18 months, he said, his accent crisp and British. "I've seen a lot of squadrons come through. Most of them arrive thinking they know everything, and we bury them 3 weeks later." He paused. "But what I saw this morning was different. You flew like men who understood that confidence without competence is just another word for dying young." He nodded to Gibbs. "The Luftwaffe is going to study today's engagement. They're going to realize they underestimated you. Next time, they'll come prepared. The question is, will you be ready for that?" That afternoon, Jimmy sat outside his tent, cleaning his sidearm. It was busy work, something to occupy his hands while his mind processed what he'd experienced. The Webley revolver was heavy, oil slick, foreign in his hands. He'd never fired it, never expected to need it. Around the base, life continued. Ground crews worked on aircraft, patching damage, refueling, rearming. Trucks moved supplies. Someone had rigged up a cricket wicket behind the mess tent, and the sound of ball on bat carried across the sand, absurdly normal. Raleigh approached, carrying 2 tin cups of tea that had gone lukewarm in the heat. "Thought you might need this," he said, handing one over. They sat in silence for a while, sipping the bitter brew. "I keep thinking about Mitchell," Jimmy finally said. "This morning he was right there, joking about his girl, about what he'd do when we got leave in Cairo. Now he's just gone." "Yeah," Raleigh said quietly. "The German I shot, the 109. I keep wondering if he made it back, if he's sitting somewhere right now, cleaning his pistol and thinking about the Australian who nearly ended him. Does it bother you? The shooting?" Jimmy considered the question. "Not the way I thought it would. In the moment, it was just mechanics. See the target, line up the shot, press the trigger. But now, thinking about it," he trailed off. "It's strange, isn't it?" Raleigh mused. "We don't know their names. Don't know if they've got families waiting for them. Don't know their stories. They're just silhouettes in the sky. Easier that way, I suppose." "Is it, though?" Jimmy asked. "Easier?" Raleigh had no answer for that. April 10th, 1942. 2 days later. The telegram arrived at a modest house in Broken Hill, New South Wales. Mrs. Elizabeth Mitchell was hanging washing when the boy from the post office came cycling up the dusty street. She knew what it meant before she opened it. Everyone in town knew what those telegrams meant. "The Royal Australian Air Force deeply regrets to inform you that your son, Pilot Officer David Robert Mitchell, is missing in action following aerial operations over North Africa. Every effort is being made to locate—" The rest of the words blurred. She sat down heavily on the front step, still holding the damp sheet she'd been about to hang. The telegram fluttered in the hot wind. 2 days later, in a tent 8,000 miles away, Chaplain Lieutenant Peter Morrison conducted a memorial service. There was no body to bury, no grave to mark. Just 24 young men standing in the desert heat, singing "Abide With Me," while the wind scattered their words across the sand. Dave Mitchell's personal effects, a watch, some letters, the photograph of Sarah, were packed into a small box to be sent home. His Kittyhawk, P40E serial number, A29133, was already reassigned to a replacement pilot who'd arrived that morning. The war moved on. It always did. April 15th, 1942, RAF City Hanaish. 5 days after their first engagement, the squadron was scrambled again. then again the next day, and the day after that. The rhythm of desert warfare established itself, long hours of boredom punctuated by minutes of pure terror. Jimmy learned to sleep through the nightly bombing raids, learned to eat sand-contaminated food without complaint, learned to deal with dysentery and dehydration, and the peculiar claustrophobia of living in open spaces that stretched to infinity. More importantly, he learned to fight. Each engagement taught lessons. The Luftwaffe adapted, coming in higher, faster, with better tactics. But the Australians adapted too, developing new formations, new approaches, building on their strengths while minimizing their weaknesses. The Germans had stopped calling them farm boys. Intelligence intercepts, decoded messages that headquarters shared sparingly, revealed a different tone. The Luftwaffe pilots spoke of the Australians with grudging respect now, warning new arrivals not to underestimate them, noting their aggression and their unwillingness to break off even when outnumbered. "Seems we've made an impression," Gibbs remarked dryly during one briefing, reading from an intelligence summary. "One captured 109 pilot told his interrogators that we fight like men who have nothing to lose and everything to prove." "He's not wrong," Raleigh muttered. But the cost was mounting. After Mitchell came Henderson, shot down over enemy lines. Then Armstrong, who collided with a damaged Stuka and went down with it. Then Roberts, whose engine failed on takeoff, the subsequent crash killing him instantly. New pilots arrived to replace them, fresh-faced boys who looked impossibly young. Jimmy trained them, passing on hard-won knowledge, and tried not to think about how many of them would be dead within a month. He was 23 years old. He felt 50. April 28, 1942. Evening. Jimmy sat on the wing of his Kittyhawk, watching the sun set over the desert. The sky was ablaze with color, reds and oranges and purples that seemed impossible, too beautiful for a place so hostile to life. He pulled out his mother's letter, reading it for the 100th time by the failing light. "Please come home to us." He'd started a dozen replies, but none of them seemed adequate. How could he explain what it was like out here? How could he describe the strange mixture of terror and exhilaration, the bonds formed with men who might die tomorrow, the way combat simplified everything down to the most basic equation, survive or don't? How could he tell her that he was afraid, constantly afraid, but that somehow the fear had become manageable? That he'd learned to function through it, to think through it, to fight through it? That he'd become someone she might not recognize? "Sir?" A young pilot officer approached. Williams, one of the replacements, couldn't be more than 19. "Squadron leader wants to see you." Jimmy folded the letter away and dropped from the wing. "What's it about?" "Don't know, sir, but he's got that look. The one that means something's coming." Operations tent, 1945. Ours Gibbies was standing over a map when Jimmy arrived, along with the other senior pilots. The squadron leader looked tired, older than his 30 years. "Gentlemen," he said without preamble, "we've been tasked with a special operation. Intelligence has located a forward Luftwaffe airfield, lightly defended. They're staging bombers from there to hit our supply convoys. Command wants it neutralized." He pointed to a spot on the map, deep in enemy-held territory. "This is going to be low-level, high risk. We'll be flying at dawn, under their radar, hitting them before they can scramble. With luck, we'll catch their aircraft on the ground." "And without luck?" someone asked. Gibbies smiled grimly. "Without luck, it'll be the shortest combat mission any of us ever fly. Questions?" Jimmy studied the map, calculating distances, fuel consumption, exposure time over enemy territory. It was audacious, bordering on reckless. The kind of operation that either succeeded brilliantly or failed catastrophically, with no middle ground. "When do we brief the full squadron?" he asked. 400 hours tomorrow. We're wheels up at first light." "Get some rest, gentlemen. You're going to need it." As they filed out of the tent, Raleigh fell into step beside Jimmy. "Thoughts?" he asked quietly. Jimmy looked up at the stars beginning to emerge in the darkening sky. Somewhere up there, Mitchell and the others were waiting, watching. "I think," he said slowly, that the Luftwaffe is about to learn another lesson about underestimating Australians. The desert night was cold. But somewhere in the darkness, engines were being prepared, weapons loaded, missions planned. The war continued, and in the morning, they would fly again. The pre-dawn darkness was absolute. Jimmy stood with the other pilots around a makeshift table illuminated by a single kerosene lamp, its flickering light casting dancing shadows across the map spread before them. The temperature had dropped to near freezing, and breath misted in the cold desert air. Squadron leader Gibbies traced a line across the map with his finger. Target is here, Martuba Airfield, approximately 120 miles behind enemy lines. Intelligence indicates 12 to 15 aircraft on the ground, mostly Ju-88 bombers with light fighter cover. Guard contingent is estimated at company strength, but they're not expecting trouble. He looked up, meeting each pilot's eyes in turn. We'll go in at dawn, 50 feet off the deck. Navigation will be critical. 1 degree off course and we'll miss the target entirely. Radio silence until we're over the field. Hit fast, hit hard, and get out. Total time over target. 3 minutes, no more. Jimmy studied the route. They'd be flying over hostile territory for nearly 30 minutes each way. No fighter escort, no rescue if someone went down. Just 14 Kittyhawks against whatever the Germans could throw at them. Fuel? Someone asked. Tight, Gibbies admitted. We'll have maybe 10 minutes of combat time before we have to break for home. Anyone who gets separated is on their own. We won't have the fuel for search patterns. What about anti-aircraft positions? Flak guns here and here. Gibbies pointed to positions flanking the airfield. We'll approach from the east, out of the rising sun. Should give us a few extra seconds before they acquire us. Once they do, expect heavy fire. The Germans don't like visitors. Pilot Officer Williams, the young replacement who'd fetched Jimmy the previous evening, raised his hand tentatively. His face was pale in the lamplight. Sir, what if we can't find the target? Gibbs' expression softened slightly. Then we bring our aircraft home and try again another day. This isn't about heroics, Williams. It's about removing a threat to our supply lines. We do it smart, or we don't do it at all. But Jimmy could see the calculation behind Gibbs' eyes. Command had ordered this strike. Political pressure from Cairo, from London, from politicians who measured success in dramatic gestures. The squadron leader would do everything possible to bring his men home, but the mission came first. It always did. 5:30 hours, flight line. The Kittyhawk sat in a line, their engines silent, waiting. Ground crews moved among them like priests attending to sacred objects, checking fuel lines, arming weapons, making final adjustments. The smell of aviation fuel was sharp in the cold air. Jimmy performed his pre-flight inspection by the light of a flashlight, running his hands over control surfaces, checking for hydraulic leaks, verifying ammunition counts. 200 rounds per gun, 3,600 rounds total. Enough to do serious damage if his aim was true. His hands moved automatically through the familiar routine, but his mind was elsewhere. He thought about his mother, probably asleep in Brisbane, unaware that her son was about to fly into the heart of enemy territory. He thought about Mitchell and the others who hadn't come back, wondered if he'd join them before the sun was fully risen. Ready? Raleigh appeared beside him, his own pre-flight complete. As I'll ever be. Remember when we used to think flying was glamorous? All those recruiting posters with clean uniforms and perfect weather? Jimmy laughed, a short, bitter sound. Yeah, they forgot to mention the sand, the heat, and people actively trying to end you. False advertising, really. We should write a complaint. They stood together in comfortable silence, two young men on the edge of something that might be heroic or might be catastrophic, and no way to know which until it was over. Jimmy, Raleigh said quietly, if something happens out there... Don't, Jimmy interrupted. We're both coming back. We say what needs saying when this is done. Raleigh nodded, but Jimmy saw him touch his breast pocket where he kept his own letters from home. Mount up, Gibbies called across the flight line. The moment had arrived. 0547 hours, 50 feet above the desert. Flying at extremely low altitude in the pre-dawn darkness required absolute concentration. The desert floor rushed past beneath Jimmy's Kittyhawk, a gray blur barely visible in the growing light. His altimeter read 50 feet, but he trusted his eyes more, watching the sand for any rise that might reach up and swat him from the sky. The formation flew in line astern, each aircraft following the one ahead by a few hundred yards. Radio silence meant no chatter, no jokes, no reassurance, just the roar of 14 Allison engines and the whistle of wind past canopies. The sun began to rise behind them, painting the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold. Beautiful and terrible, turning the Kittyhawks into dark silhouettes against the dawn. Jimmy's hands were steady on the controls now, his earlier nervousness burned away by the focus required for low-altitude flying. Navigation was by dead reckoning and landmarks. A dried riverbed here, a cluster of rocks there, a burned-out tank marking some forgotten skirmish. 30 minutes of flying through enemy territory. Each minute brought them deeper into German-controlled desert, farther from safety, closer to a target that might or might not be where intelligence said it was. Through his canopy, Jimmy could see Gibbs's aircraft ahead, rock steady despite the turbulence. The squadron leader had flown this route a dozen times in his mind, memorizing every turn, every landmark. Now he flew it for real, leading 13 men who trusted him with their lives. The desert began to change. More rocks, less sand. Signs of human activity, vehicle tracks, supply dumps, trenches. They were getting close. Aero 612 hours, 3 miles from target. Gibbs's Kittyhawk waggled its wings. The signal. Jimmy felt his pulse accelerate. He reached forward, flipping the switch that armed his guns. Around him, he knew the others were doing the same. The formation began to spread out, each aircraft moving into attack position. They'd practiced this maneuver dozens of times over friendly desert, but practice and reality were different animals entirely. 2 miles. The sun was fully above the horizon now, bright and merciless. 1 mile. Jimmy could see it. Martuba Airfield, exactly where intelligence had promised. A dirt strip running east-west, with aircraft dispersed around its perimeter. Tents, vehicles, and yes, anti-aircraft positions flanking the runway. 1/2 mile. Someone on the ground must have spotted them because suddenly the field erupted into activity. Figures running, vehicles starting, the anti-aircraft guns beginning to traverse, seeking targets. All aircraft, attack! Gibbs's voice broke radio silence, and 14 Kittyhawks roared across the perimeter at wave-top height. The world exploded into chaos. Tracer fire reached up like angry fingers, bright against the morning sky. Jimmy picked his target, a Ju-88 bomber sitting near a fuel bowser, its crew scrambling to reach it. He lined up the shot, his finger tightening on the trigger. The Kittyhawk's 6 machine guns erupted, the recoil shaking the entire airframe. He watched his tracers walk across the bomber's fuselage, metal shredding, glass shattering. The fuel bowser exploded in an orange fireball that made him flinch even at 300 yards. No time to admire his work. He hauled back on the stick, climbing just enough to clear the flames, already selecting his next target. Another bomber. This one with its engine starting, propellers beginning to turn. More tracer fire. Closer now. Something cracked past his canopy. Too close. Much too close. The anti-aircraft gunners were finding their range. He fired again. A shorter burst this time. The bomber's cockpit shattered. He flashed overhead at 300 miles per hour, the slipstream from his propeller raising a cloud of dust below. Around him, the other Kittyhawks were wreaking havoc. Gibbs had hit a fuel dump, and secondary explosions were cooking off, sending debris flying. Raleigh's aircraft pulled up from an attack run, smoke trailing from an aircraft behind him. But the Germans were fighting back. The anti-aircraft fire was intensifying, creating a web of tracer fire that the Kittyhawks had to weave through. And in the distance, Jimmy could see aircraft taking off from another field, reinforcements coming fast. 2 minutes, Gibbs called. Finish your runs and form up. Jimmy pulled into a hard turn, looking for one more target. There, a fighter, a BF-109, taxiing desperately toward the runway, trying to get airborne. He dove on it, guns blazing. His rounds stitched across the taxiway, then across the 109's wing. The aircraft slewed sideways, its landing gear collapsing. "Brake! Brake left!" someone screamed over the radio. Jimmy reacted instinctively, throwing the Kittyhawk into a hard turn. Tracer fire streaked through the space where he'd been, so close he could feel the shockwave. He looked back, saw a German fighter, one of the reinforcements, already on station, pulling around for another pass. His fuel gauge was well into the yellow. Time to go. "All aircraft disengage! Head for home!" Gibbs ordered, his voice tight with strain. The Kittyhawks broke off their attacks, forming up as best they could while dodging anti-aircraft fire and the pursuing fighters. Jimmy pushed his throttle forward, coaxing every bit of speed from his engine. Behind them, Martuba Airfield was a scene of destruction. At least 9 aircraft were burning, fuel dumps were exploding, and thick black smoke rose into the morning sky like a funeral pyre. But they weren't clear yet. 6-7 hours, outbound. The German fighters pursued them, 3 BF-109s against 14 Kittyhawks. Normally, that would favor the Australians, but they were low on fuel, deep in enemy territory, and desperate to get home. "Stay together," Gibbies commanded. "Don't let them separate us." The 109s were faster, especially at altitude, but the Kittyhawks had numbers. When one German fighter dove on a target, 2 Australians would turn into it, forcing the attacker to break off or risk being caught in a crossfire. It became a running battle across the desert, 15 aircraft weaving and dodging, firing and evading. Jimmy's fuel gauge crept lower. His ammunition counter showed less than 100 rounds remaining. Then Williams made a mistake. The young pilot, perhaps panicking, perhaps just inexperienced, broke formation trying to evade a 109. Immediately, he became isolated, alone against an experienced German pilot who recognized the opportunity. "Williams, get back in formation," Gibbies shouted. But it was too late. The 109 latched onto Williams's tail, methodical and precise. Jimmy watched in horror as tracer fire walked up the young pilot's aircraft. Smoke erupted from the engine. The Kittyhawk's nose dropped. I'm hit! Williams's voice was high with terror. "Engine's gone! I can't—" The radio cut off as the Kittyhawk plowed into the desert in a cloud of sand and debris. There was no fire, no explosion. Just sudden, absolute silence from Williams's radio. "Keep moving," Gibbies ordered, his voice hard. "We can't help him now." Jimmy felt sick. Williams had been 19 years old. He'd shown Jimmy a picture of his parents just last week, asked advice about what to write in his letters home. Now he was gone, his aircraft a crumpled wreck somewhere in the desert below. The 109s, perhaps satisfied with their victory, or perhaps low on fuel themselves, broke off the pursuit. The remaining Kittyhawks flew on through the growing morning heat, racing the sun towards safety. 06:45 hours, RAF Sidi Hanaish. 13 aircraft landed, 13 out of 14. Jimmy's Kittyhawk touched down on fumes, the engine coughing as the last drops of fuel reached the carburetors. Ground crews rushed forward even before he'd stopped rolling, already assessing damage, counting bullet holes, preparing for the next mission that would inevitably come. He shut down the engine and sat in the sudden silence, his hand still gripping the control stick. Around him, the cockpit smelled of cordite and sweat and fear. His flight suit was soaked through despite the morning chill. Through his canopy, he could see the other pilots climbing out of their aircraft. Some moved with the jerky energy of adrenaline still coursing through their veins. Others moved slowly, mechanically, like old men. Gibbies stood by the operations tent, clipboard in hand, checking off each returning aircraft. When the count reached 13 and stopped, his shoulders sagged almost imperceptibly. Jimmy forced himself to climb down. His legs nearly buckled when they took his weight. A ground crewman steadied him. "Easy, sir. You're home." Home. The word seemed meaningless. Williams would never be home again. Mitchell and Henderson and all the others. They'd never go home. Sir? The crewman was looking at him with concern. Are you wounded? Jimmy shook his head. No, I'm fine. But he wasn't fine. None of them were. 1,000 hours. Debriefing. The debriefing was clinical, professional. Gibbies went through each pilot's report, compiling damage assessments, confirming target destruction. The intelligence officer took notes, already preparing the after-action report that would be sent up the chain of command. Preliminary assessment, the intelligence officer summarized, is 9 enemy aircraft destroyed on the ground, 3 damaged beyond repair, fuel and ammunition stores destroyed, airfield temporarily non-operational. Allied losses, 1 aircraft, pilot presumed captured or deceased. Presumed, such a careful word, as if there was any real doubt about Williams's fate. The mission was a success, Gibbies said flatly. Command will be pleased. No one responded. Success was measured in destroyed aircraft and damaged infrastructure. But sitting in that tent, looking at the empty chair where Williams should have been, success felt like a hollow word. Gentlemen, Gibbies continued, his voice gentler now, I know today was hard. We lost a good man. But what we did matters. Those bombers were hitting our supply convoys, our ground forces. How many Allied lives did we save by taking them out? Jimmy wanted to believe that, wanted to think that Williams's sacrifice had meaning, had purchased something valuable. But all he could see was a 19-year-old kid who'd never get to write another letter home. Get some rest, Gibbies dismissed them. We're stood down for 48 hours while maintenance works on the aircraft. Use the time. That afternoon, Jimmy found himself walking toward the edge of the base, away from the tents and aircraft, out into the desert proper. The heat was intense, the sun a hammer beating down from a cloudless sky. Sweat soaked through his shirt within minutes. He walked until the base was a distant collection of shapes wavering in the heat haze, until there was nothing around him but sand and rock and silence. Then he sat down on a flat stone and pulled out his mother's letter. Please come home to us. He tried to imagine her face when the telegram arrived, tried to imagine his sister Margaret reading the words. His father, who never showed emotion, finally breaking. For the first time since arriving in North Africa, Jimmy began to write a reply. Dear Mum, I don't know if this letter will reach you or if I'll be alive when it does. I want you to know that I'm trying to be brave, trying to do what's right. But it's so much harder than I thought it would be. We lost another pilot today. His name was Williams, and he was just a kid, really. He died scared and alone, and I couldn't help him. He paused, staring at the words. Then he crumpled the paper and started again. Dear Mum, I'm well. The weather here is hot, but we're managing. The squadron is performing admirably, and I'm proud to serve with these men. I think of you and Dad and Margaret every day. Your loving son, James. Lies, all lies, but sometimes lies were kinder than truth. He folded the letter carefully and tucked it into his pocket. The sun beat down. The desert stretched to infinity. And somewhere far away, in offices in Cairo and London and Berlin, men were studying maps and planning the next operation, the next battle, the next place where young men would be asked to fight and die for reasons that grew hazier with each passing day. Jimmy sat alone on his rock and watched the sun track across the sky, and wondered how many more letters he'd have to write before this war finally ended, if he lived long enough to write them at all. The dawn air was different. Jimmy felt it the moment he stepped out of his tent, a tension in the atmosphere, a heaviness that had nothing to do with humidity. Around the base, pilots and ground crew moved with quiet purpose, speaking in hushed tones. Intelligence had come through during the night. The Luftwaffe was planning something big. Squadron leader Gibbies stood at the operations tent, studying a map by lamplight. Dark circles shadowed his eyes. He'd been up all night coordinating with other RAF squadrons, piecing together fragmentary intelligence reports into something resembling a complete picture. Gentlemen, he said as the pilots assembled, we've been waiting for this. The Germans are launching a major offensive today. Ground forces are pushing toward our positions, and they're bringing everything they have. Bombers, fighters, ground attack aircraft. This is their attempt to break through our lines. He traced a line on the map with his finger. We'll be part of a larger operation involving multiple squadrons. Our specific task is to intercept bomber formations heading for our forward positions. Expect heavy fighter escort. Expect the best pilots they have. Raleigh caught Jimmy's eye. They'd both known this day would come. The skirmishes, the raids, the running battles, those had been preparation. This was the real test. How many? Someone asked. Intelligence estimates 50-plus aircraft inbound. We'll have support from other squadrons, but we'll be outnumbered regardless. Gibbies looked around the tent, meeting each pilot's gaze. I won't lie to you. This is going to be the hardest fight we've faced. Some of us won't come back. The silence was absolute. But, Gibbs continued, his voice strengthening, we've proven something these past weeks. We've proven that skill and determination matter more than reputation. We've proven that the Luftwaffe's experts were wrong about us. Today, we finish that lesson. He straightened, his voice ringing clear in the morning air. 3 weeks ago, they called us farm boys. They dismissed our training. They thought we'd break at the first real test. A fierce smile crossed his weathered face. Today, we show them what Australian farm boys can do when they're properly motivated. Today, we fight for every man we've lost, for every convoy we've protected, for every soldier on the ground counting on us to keep the sky clear. He paused, then added quietly, and we fight for each other. That's what matters most. EU-61 hours. Flight line. The entire squadron was scrambling, all operational aircraft, every pilot who could fly. Jimmy performed his pre-flight check with practiced efficiency, his hands moving through the familiar motions while his mind raced ahead to what was coming. His Kittyhawk bore the scars of weeks of combat, patched bullet holes, replaced panels, fresh paint over damage. The ground crew had named her Southern Cross, painting a constellation alongside the standard RAAF roundel. She'd brought him home through everything the desert had thrown at them. He had to trust she'd do it one more time. Jimmy. Raleigh jogged over, his flight gear already on. I've been thinking. Dangerous habit. If this goes sideways, if things get bad up there, I want you to know that flying with you has been an honor. These past months, everything we've been through, I wouldn't have wanted anyone else on my wing. Jimmy felt his throat tighten. Raleigh. No, let me finish. You remember back in Brisbane, when we were just kids learning to fly, you said you wanted to do something that mattered? Something bigger than just working a regular job and living a regular life? Raleigh smiled, but his eyes were serious. Well, mate, I think we've done that. Whatever happens today, we've done that. Jimmy clasped his friend's shoulder. We're both coming back. You hear me? We finish this fight, we go home, and we spend the rest of our lives boring people with stories about what we did in the war. Deal. They shook hands, then walked to their respective aircraft. 6:42 hours, 18,000 feet above the western desert. The sky was crowded with aircraft. Jimmy had never seen so many planes in one place. Kittyhawks, Hurricanes, even some American P-40s from other squadrons, all converging toward the same point where intelligence predicted the German formation would appear. Below, the desert stretched endlessly, indifferent to the drama about to unfold above it. Jimmy thought about the soldiers down there, dug into trenches and fighting positions, completely dependent on the pilots overhead to keep the bombers away. Contact! The radio crackled. Bandits at 2 o'clock high, range 10 miles. Jimmy's pulse accelerated. He squinted against the sun, searching. Then he saw them, a massive formation of aircraft, dark against the morning sky. Ju-87 Stukas and Ju-88 bombers, dozens of them, escorted by what looked like an entire fighter wing of Bf-109s. All aircraft, this is Red Leader. Gibbs's voice was steady, calm. Execute as briefed. Remember your training. Good hunting. The formations converged. What followed would later be called the Battle of Bir Hakeim, though that name wouldn't encompass the full scope of the aerial combat that raged for over an hour above the desert. Official records would note aircraft destroyed, missions accomplished, Tactical objectives achieved. But for Jimmy, diving into that swirling chaos of aircraft and tracer fire, the battle became a series of moments, each one eternal and fleeting simultaneously. Moment 1. His first pass at a Stuka formation, guns hammering, watching his rounds tear into a bomber's wing, the aircraft rolling inverted, beginning its death spiral toward the sand below. Moment 2. A 109 appearing from nowhere, tracers reaching for him, rolling inverted, pulling through, the horizon spinning as he fought for position. The German pilot was good, very good, but Jimmy had learned from every engagement, had refined his tactics through weeks of combat. He used the Kittyhawk's turning ability, bleeding the 109's energy, waiting for the opening. When it came, he took it. A 2-second burst, perfectly aimed. The 109's engine erupted in smoke and flame. Moment 3. Seeing Raleigh's aircraft locked in combat with two 109s simultaneously, both Germans working together to trap him. Jimmy dove to help, screaming through the radio, "Hold on, Raleigh, I'm coming!" His intervention broke up the attack, forcing one 109 to break off. But the other stayed on Raleigh's tail, persistent, deadly. Jimmy tried to get an angle, but the aircraft were too close, moving too fast. Then Raleigh did something Jimmy had never seen before, a maneuver so desperate and dangerous it bordered on suicidal. He chopped his throttle completely, extending his flaps. The Kittyhawk's speed bled off dramatically, and the 109, unable to slow quickly enough, overshot, directly into Jimmy's gun sight. He didn't hesitate. His guns roared, and the 109 came apart, pieces of aircraft tumbling through the sky. "Thanks, mate." Raleigh's voice was shaky but alive. "Thought I was done for." Moment 4. The sky beginning to clear as the German formation broke apart under the sustained Allied attack. Bombers jettisoning their loads and fleeing. Fighters disengaging, low on fuel and ammunition. The Allied fighters pursuing, harrying them every mile back toward their own lines. Moment 5. Checking his fuel gauge and realizing he had maybe 5 minutes before he'd be gliding. Looking around at the dispersed aircraft, trying to spot his squadron mates, counting them off. 1, 2, 3. Where was number 4? 0751 hours, heading home. The Kittyhawks formed up as best they could, battered and low on everything. Jimmy's aircraft had taken hits. He could feel the controls responding sluggishly, could smell hydraulic fluid leaking somewhere behind him. But the engine was still running, and that was what mattered. "Sound off," Gibby's ordered. "Red 2. Red 2. Operational. Red 3. Red 3. Took some hits but flying." Down the list, each pilot reporting in. Jimmy held his breath, counting. 11. They had 11 aircraft. "Red 8? Gibby's called. No response. "Red 8, do you copy?" Silence. "Red 12? More silence. Jimmy felt something cold settle in his stomach. He scanned the sky around them, hoping to see a lone Kittyhawk limping along behind. But there was nothing except empty air and the distant smudges of other formations heading home. "All aircraft, maintain formation," Gibby said quietly. "Let's get home." 0815 hours. RAF Sidi Hanaish. The landing was rough. Jimmy's damaged controls made the approach difficult, and he bounced twice before settling onto the runway. Ground crews ran forward even before he'd stopped, assessing the damage, checking for wounded. He shut down the engine and sat in the sudden silence. His hands were shaking now, the adrenaline finally wearing off. His flight suit was drenched with sweat despite the morning chill. He could taste copper in his mouth. He'd bitten his lip at some point during the combat, hadn't even noticed. Slowly, he climbed down from the cockpit. His legs were unsteady, and he had to lean against the fuselage for a moment until the world stopped spinning. Around him, the other pilots were emerging from their aircraft. Some were laughing with the manic energy of survival. Others were silent, pale, processing what they'd just experienced. Ground crews worked frantically, already preparing the aircraft for the next mission that would surely come. Gibby's was standing by the operations tent, clipboard in hand, waiting for the final count. When the last aircraft taxied to a stop, he made a notation and walked toward the assembled pilots. Initial reports from other squadrons indicate the German offensive has been blunted, he announced. The bombers never reached our ground forces. The mission was a success. He paused, his expression grave. We lost Flight Lieutenant Morrison and Pilot Officer Chen. Both went down over enemy territory engaging superior numbers. Both bought time for the rest of us to complete the mission. Morrison. Jimmy hadn't known him well. He'd been with the squadron less than a week, a transfer from another unit. But Chen had been at Amberley from the beginning, had trained alongside them, had flown dozens of missions, had a wife in Sydney and a daughter he'd never met, born while he was overseas. Their sacrifice was not in vain, Gibbies continued. Today proved beyond any doubt that this squadron, that Australian pilots, can match anyone in the sky. The Luftwaffe came at us with everything they had, and we sent them home defeated. He straightened, coming to attention. I'm proud of every man here. You've exceeded every expectation, overcome every doubt, proven every skeptic wrong. You are, without question, the finest pilots I've ever had the honor to lead. That evening, Jimmy sat outside his tent as the sun set over the desert one more time. The day's heat was fading, replaced by the familiar night chill. Around the base, life continued. Repairs, resupply, preparation for tomorrow's missions. Raleigh found him there carrying 2 tin cups of tea. Thought you might want this, he said, settling down beside his friend. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the colors fade from the sky. Somewhere in the distance, a jackal called, its cry lonely and haunting. Morrison and Chen, Raleigh finally said. Plus Williams, Mitchell, Henderson, Armstrong, Roberts. That's 7. 7 out of the 24 we started with. I know. Is it worth it? All this? Raleigh gestured vaguely at the base, the aircraft, the war. Do you think it matters? Jimmy considered the question. He thought about the soldiers in their trenches, the ones who hadn't been bombed today because the Kittyhawks had kept the sky clear. He thought about the supply convoys that had made it through, because they'd destroyed the airfield at Martuba. He thought about the intelligence reports showing the Luftwaffe's growing respect, their warnings to new pilots not to underestimate the Australians. Yes, he said finally. I think it matters. Maybe not in the way we imagined back in Brisbane, thinking we'd be heroes in some grand adventure. But it matters. The Germans learned their lesson then? About dismissing us? Jimmy smiled grimly. They learned. We may have been farm boys once, but we became something else out here. Something they didn't expect and couldn't prepare for. He pulled out his mother's letter, worn now from constant handling, and the reply he'd written but never sent. When this is over, when we finally go home, we'll carry this with us. All of it. The good and the bad, the victories and the losses, the men who made it and the men who didn't. He looked at Raleigh. That's what we owe them. Morrison, Chen, all the others. We carry them home. Raleigh nodded slowly. And we keep their story alive. We tell people what they did, what it cost, what it meant. Exactly. The stars were emerging now, bright and cold in the desert darkness. The same stars that shone over Brisbane, over Sydney, over every corner of the world where young men were fighting and dying in a war that seemed to have no end. But here, in this small corner of North Africa, something had been proven. Courage wasn't about birthplace or breeding or reputation. It was about ordinary people doing extraordinary things when circumstances demanded it. About farm boys from the outback who learned to fly, who faced down the world's most vaunted air force, and who refused to break no matter the cost. The Luftwaffe experts had dismissed RAF training. They'd assumed colonial pilots couldn't match European sophistication and experience. They'd been catastrophically wrong. And in the skies above Africa, in the burning wrecks scattered across the desert, in the reports being written and analyzed in headquarters from Cairo to Berlin, that lesson was being learned. The Australians had arrived, and they'd proven that heart, determination, and the will to defend what mattered could overcome any advantage of experience or equipment. May 16th, 1942. Dawn. The scramble bell rang again. Jimmy was already moving, pulling on his flight gear, running for the flight line. Around him, the other pilots did the same. Tired, battered, grieving, but ready. Always ready. His Kittyhawk waited, patched and repaired overnight, the ground crew having worked through the darkness to make her airworthy. The shark-mouth grinned defiantly at the rising sun. As he climbed into the cockpit, performing the familiar pre-flight routine one more time, Jimmy thought about all the missions he'd flown, all the combat he'd seen, all the lessons learned at such terrible cost. The Luftwaffe had underestimated them. That had been their first mistake. Assuming the Australians would quit had been their second. The engine roared to life. The propeller became a blur. The sun painted the desert in shades of gold. And once more, the Kittyhawks rose into the African sky, carrying with them the legacy of every pilot who'd flown before, every lesson learned, every sacrifice made. The war was far from over. More battles waited, more challenges to overcome, more losses to endure. But the Australians had proven what needed proving. And that lesson would echo through the remainder of the war, through history, through the memories of everyone who'd witnessed what happened when determination met duty in the skies above the western desert. They had been called farm boys. They had become legends. And the Luftwaffe would never make the same mistake again. The 3-Squadron RAF continued to serve in North Africa until the end of the campaign in 1943. They flew thousands of sorties, destroyed hundreds of enemy aircraft, and earned a reputation as one of the most effective fighter squadrons in the theater. Flight Lieutenant James Caldwell survived the war, as did Flight Officer Alan Rawlinson. Both returned to Australia, where they lived quiet lives far from the desert skies where they'd proven themselves. But they never forgot. None of them did. The men who fell, Mitchell, Williams, Morrison, Chen, and all the others, were buried in Commonwealth war graves across North Africa. Their names are carved in stone, memorials to sacrifice that words can never fully capture. The Luftwaffe's dismissal of colonial training became a case study in military academies, an object lesson in the dangers of underestimating an enemy based on preconceptions rather than reality. The Australian Kittyhawk pilots had taught the world's most feared Air Force a lesson it would never forget. Some lessons are learned through study, others are learned through fire. This was the latter.